Don't look at them.
Hideko hissed, her voice sharp as the wire. October 26, 1944. Camp Adair Satellite Detail, Oregon. Hisako flinched, turning her back to the county road. The squeal of the school bus brakes felt like a physical blow. She smelled diesel and damp Oregon pine. The children's voices, high and alien, spilled out. Propaganda posters flashed in her mind, grinning demons with pitchforks, American civilians tossing stones. She expected the impact, the insults, but there was only shuffling. Then a small sound near the fence. She chanced to look. A small girl, blonde hair bright against the grey afternoon, was watching her.
Only her. Hisako froze, bracing for the spit. Instead, a small hand pushed something through the wire.
A small brown rectangle wrapped in silver foil.
The little girl just
watched her. Curiously, Hisako looked at the corporal standing 10 yards away. He just nodded, shifting his rifle. The offering. The simple, silent innocence. We hope these small stories of connection resonate. Let us know in the comments what country you are watching from. 6 weeks earlier, Angel Island, California. Hisako stepped down from the canvas-backed truck. The cold was the first shock. It was not the biting salt spray of the Pacific crossing, nor the damp subterranean chill of the holding cells on Angel Island. This was a different cold. It was thin, sharp, and smelled of wet pine and damp earth. It was an ancient smell, heavy and absolute. It felt, to Hisako, like the air inside a tomb. "Move it! Move it!" The shout was harsh, the English words like sharp stones she could not grasp. A corporal, tall and broad in his olive-drab uniform, pointed toward a gate. He did not shove them. He did not raise his rifle. He just pointed. Hisako kept her eyes down, fixed on the muddy heels of Hideko, the older woman who had been a nurse in Saipan, walking just in front of her. Do not look at their faces. This was the first rule of survival, the one they had whispered to each other in the dark, swaying hold of the transport ship. They are demons. Do not meet the eyes of a demon, or it will see your soul and steal it. The posters printed in Tokyo had shown them, grinning, horned monsters with white skin and round eyes carrying pitchforks. The fence was the second shock. It was tall, strung with 5 lines of barbed wire that glistened with a fine Oregon mist. It looked temporary, almost flimsy, as if constructed in a great hurry, yet it felt utterly final. Beyond the wire, the forest crowded in, a dark, dripping sea of Douglas fir trees that seemed to swallow the weak afternoon light. This was Oregon. Camp Adair, the sign at the main processing depot, had read hours earlier. But this was not the main camp. This was a satellite, a small, raw cluster of wooden barracks hastily erected in a muddy clearing. A place, they were told, for agricultural labor. Hisako's stomach churned with a mixture of terror and exhaustion. The propaganda had been clear. American soldiers were brutes. They tortured prisoners for sport. They took women. Every day since landing in California had been a torment of waiting for the inevitable. She had braced for the screaming, the blows, the ultimate violation. Yet the violence never came in the way she expected. There was no beating. There was just this impersonal efficiency, this cold, procedural handling, as if they were livestock, not people. It was confusing, and the confusion amplified the fear. They were herded into a long, bare room.
A mess hall.
It smelled of boiled potatoes and stale coffee. The corporal stood at the front. He spoke again, slowly this time, but the sounds were still just noise. Another soldier, this one younger, with glasses, began handing items down a line. Hisako flinched when her turn came. The soldier did not look at her. He placed a metal tray in front of her. On it sat 2 thick slices of dark, heavy bread, a pale yellow square of what might be butter, and a small, rectangular tin of meat. She stared at it. Hideko, beside her, slowly picked up the tin. She read the blue letters painted on the side. Spam, Hisako looked up. It was a mistake, a violation of her own rule. She accidentally met the eye of the corporal by the door. He was not grinning. He was not holding a whip. He looked bored. He was just watching them, his arms crossed. She lowered her gaze immediately, her hands trembling as she touched the bread. It was soft. The propaganda had not prepared her for this. It had not prepared her for the terrifying, indifferent banality of the enemy. The work began before the sun had fully risen, burning off the thick morning fog. They were marched a quarter-mile from the barracks to a vast, muddy field that stretched toward a line of trees. The field was bordered on one side by the county road. The only thing separating them from that road was the same flimsy barrier, 5 strands of barbed wire strung between untreated wooden posts. Hisako watched the corporal. He carried his rifle slung casually over one shoulder, barrel pointed toward the ground. He and 2 other guards did not stand over them. They positioned themselves at the corners of the field, smoking, talking amongst themselves, watching the perimeter more than the prisoners. "This is the work," Hideko muttered, picking up a rough burlap sack and a metal harvesting fork.
Potatoes.
"It is permitted by the Geneva rules. We must work." Hisako copied her, driving the fork into the cold, heavy soil. The ground resisted. It was nothing like the soft, volcanic earth of home. This soil was dense, clay-like, and studded with rocks. Each potato she unearthed felt like a small victory against the land itself. For the first hour, there was only the sound of metal scraping earth, the rhythmic thud of potatoes tossed into sacks, and the quiet, punctuated orders of the guards. The labor was hard, and it forced the terror into a small, tight knot at the base of her stomach. She focused on the task: drive the fork, lift the soil, find the pale tubers, drop them in the sack. Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the camp or the field. It was the rumble of an engine, low and straining, coming from the road. Hisako froze. The other women froze too. A large, rusted blue truck piled high with lumber was rattling slowly down the road. It was not a military vehicle. It was civilian. Inside the cab, a man in a flannel shirt and a worn hat was driving. He saw them. He slowed the truck, almost to a crawl, and leaned his head out the window. His face was weathered, his expression unreadable as he stared openly at the group of Japanese women digging in the mud. "Kao o kakusu," Hideko hissed beside her.
"Hide your face." Hisako ducked her head, immediately turning her body slightly so her back was more exposed to the road.
She stared intently at the ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. The man's gaze felt physical, like an insect crawling on her skin. This was it. This was the true enemy, the civilian, the one whose hatred was pure, undiluted by military discipline. She waited for the shout, the curse, the object thrown from the window. The truck's engine idled for a long, agonizing moment. Hisako could feel the man's eyes, scanning them one by one. She heard the guards shift their feet, but they did not intervene. Finally, with a protesting groan of gears, the truck accelerated. The sound of the engine faded, leaving behind only the smell of its exhaust and a profound, vibrating silence. Hisako did not look up until Hideko nudged her. "He is gone." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was trembling.
No one had thrown a rock. No one had screamed.
But the violation of being seen, of being catalogued like strange animals by the side of the road, left her feeling naked and cold. She looked at the thin strands of the barbed wire fence, separating her world from his. It was not a fortress. It was a stage. She understood the new rule. The guards protected the perimeter, but they would not protect them from the eyes. Evening fell quickly in the valley. The barracks were cold, the thin wooden walls offering little defense against the damp chill that rolled down from the mountains. Hisako sat on her cot, rubbing her raw hands. They had been given a thin soup for dinner, watery but hot, and more of the heavy, dark bread. In the corner of the common room, a small wooden radio sat on a crate. One of the guards, the younger one with glasses, had brought it in and turned it on, perhaps as an act of calculated kindness, or perhaps just to fill the oppressive silence. For an hour, it played music. Strange, swinging rhythms with loud brass instruments and confident, crooning voices. It was alien music, full of a swagger and joy that felt offensive in their predicament. Hisako tried to block it out. She tried to reconcile the day, the soft bread, the bored guards, and the terrifying silent stare of the man in the blue truck. The lack of expected brutality was more unsettling than brutality itself. It made the ground unstable beneath her feet. Then the music stopped. A man's voice, deep and authoritative, began to speak. It was a news broadcast. Hisako understood almost nothing, but the tone was unmistakable. It was triumphant. She caught words she recognized from the propaganda posters back home: Pacific, victory, Imperial Army, and then, spoken with sharp condemnation, Japanese. The women in the room grew still. The radio voice, crackling with static, seemed to grow louder, filling every corner of the LAN. It was the voice of the enemy, speaking of their victories and cementing the prisoner's status as the vanquished. A younger girl near Hisako began to weep quietly.
Her face turned to the wall. "Stop it!" Hideko said, her voice low but firm.
The girl's sobs subsided into sniffles. Hideko stared at the radio, her expression hardening. "Do not listen to their lies," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "They celebrate because they are animals. They do not know honor." She leaned forward, her shadow dark in the light of the single bare bulb.
"In Saipan," she whispered, and the women around her leaned in. "I spoke to a woman who escaped the caves."
She saw it. She saw what the American Marines did when they cornered the civilians. Hisako held her breath. "They offered them food," Hideko continued, her voice dropping. "They smiled, telling them they would be safe. And when a mother and her children came out, the soldiers, they laughed." Hideko did not need to finish the story. The implied horror, the one fed by years of their own military propaganda of rape, torture, and meaningless slaughter, filled the silence. Hisako felt a cold dread settle over her, stronger than the chill in the room. Hideko's story, whether true or not, served its purpose. It was an anchor. It reaffirmed the worldview that had been shaken. The man in the truck was staring with hatred. The board guards were simply biding their time. The soft bread and the hot soup were a trick, a cruel deception to soften them before the inevitable. The radio announcer's voice droned on, triumphant. Hisako pulled her thin blanket tighter. The demons were real. They were just patient. 2 days passed in a blur of exhausting, monotonous labor. The fear, fed by Hideko's story, and the triumphant radio settled into a low, chronic ache. Hisako learned to focus on the immediate, the bite of the metal fork in the soil, the weight of the burlap sack, the burn in her shoulders. She learned to keep her head down. She learned, as the man in the blue truck had taught her, that the road was a place of exposure. She was kneeling, pulling a stubborn cluster of potatoes from the rocky earth, when a new sound cut through the quiet afternoon. It was not the rumble of a farm truck or the distant hum of a military jeep. This was a higher-pitched grinding, followed by a long, piercing squeal of brakes. Hisako looked up, her hand frozen in the dirt. A vehicle had stopped on the road, directly parallel to where she worked. It was impossibly, shockingly yellow. It was a bright, almost cheerful canary yellow, a color that had no place in this world of mud, olive drab, and grey mist. It was long like a box on wheels with rows of windows. "Nani?" A woman behind her whispered. "What is that?" Before Hideko could command them to turn, the vehicle's door folded open with a pneumatic hiss, and the children spilled out. They were not just one or two. It was a crowd. Perhaps 15 of them, in bright, strange clothing, reds and blues and checkered patterns. They carried bags and metal boxes. They were loud, their voices high and sharp,
laughing and shouting in that alien barking language. Hisako's blood went cold. The children of the demons. Hideko's warning from the barracks, they laughed, slammed into her.
Propaganda posters flashed in her mind, children with cruel, pointed faces throwing stones at weeping prisoners. This was the true test. The soldiers were disciplined, perhaps.
But these
were the unrestrained miniature versions of the civilians who hated them. A small boy, bolder than the rest, ran ahead. He stopped just on the other side of the road, a safe distance from the fence. He pointed directly at the group of women. He shouted something.
A single, sharp word. Hisako could not understand it, but the tone was mocking.
She saw his mouth twist into a grin. "Maitwai kenai!" Hideko snapped, her voice strained. "Do not look." Hisako recoiled as if struck. She whipped around, turning her back to the road so violently that she stumbled, catching herself on her hands and knees in the mud. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. She could hear the other women scrambling to turn, a small rustle of panic. She waited for the sting of the first rock against her back. She waited for the barrage of insults, for the laughter to turn cruel and targeted. The boy shouted again.
More laughter. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs.
She dug her fingers into the cold mud, anchoring herself, praying to ancestors she barely remembered. The shouting continued for what felt like an eternity. It was a chaotic, high-pitched chorus. The guards at the field's edge did nothing. They simply watched, their rifles still slung. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise receded. The high voices moved away, fading. Hisako heard the pneumatic hiss of the door closing, the groan of the engine engaging, and the sound of the large yellow vehicle pulling away. Slowly, shakily, Hisako pushed herself up. She chanced to look over her shoulder. The road was empty. The children were gone, presumably down a different path hidden by the trees. There were no stones on the ground. No marks on her clothes. A cold, shaky relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. But the relief was tainted. The yellow bus was real. The children were real.
And they had seen her.
The attack had not come today, but the threat of it was no longer a vague propaganda fear. It was a bright yellow machine that stopped just yards away. The yellow bus became a new, dreaded ritual of the afternoon. It arrived at the same time every day, just as the chill began to seep back into the air, and their muscles ached with the day's labor. Hisako trained herself not to look. The moment she heard the squeal of the brakes, she would fix her gaze on a specific point, a grey rock in the field, a crack in the handle of her harvesting fork, the frayed stitching on Hideko's sleeve. She would focus on the rhythm of her breathing, on the cold earth, on anything but the road. The children's voices would spill out, a cascade of sharp, unintelligible sounds. Hisako would brace, her shoulders tight, waiting for the shout, the pointed finger, the inevitable escalation, but the attack never came. After the first day, the boy who had shouted never did so again. The chorus of high voices seemed indifferent. They chattered amongst themselves. Hisako heard occasional laughter, but it was not directed at the field. It was the self-contained laughter of children sharing secrets, complaining about school, or planning games. They were loud, but they were loud with each other. On the fourth day of the bus's appearance, Hisako chanced a glance. The bus had stopped. The door hissed open. The children descended, but this time they did not even pause to look. They simply turned in a scattered group and began walking down a small dirt path that led away from the road, deeper into the forest. Their backs were to the prisoners. Hisako stared, her fork halfway in the air. They were
ignoring them. It was a possibility she had not considered.
Propaganda had prepared her for two outcomes: violent hatred or perhaps a calculating, cruel curiosity. It had not prepared her for indifference. This silence was a new, more confusing form of hostility. To be screamed at, to be pelted with stones, would at least confirm their existence. It would validate Hideko's warnings. It would mean they were still significant enough to be hated, to be feared as the enemy. But this, to be looked through as if they were no different from the fence posts or the muddy field itself, it was a profound negation. It suggested they were not demons to be feared, but simply irrelevant, a piece of the landscape. "They are clever," Hideko muttered, noticing Hisako's pause. She had not looked up from her work. "It is a trick. They pretend not to see us. This is how the White Devils operate."
They lull you.
"Do not be fooled," Hisako nodded, driving her fork back into the soil, but the certainty was gone. Hideko's explanation felt thin. The children had not looked clever. They had looked hurried, eager to get home, their minds already on dinner or play. She glanced at the corporal. He was leaning against a post, idly cleaning his fingernails with a small knife. He did not seem to be managing a complex psychological trick. He seemed, as always, bored. The yellow bus pulled away. Hisako was left with a disquiet far deeper than the panic of the first day. The image of the demons was beginning to crack, and what lay beneath it was a void.
If they were not the hated enemy, what were they?
It became a strange, unspoken truce. The yellow bus would arrive, the children would disembark, and the prisoners would continue to work, their heads bowed, lost in the rhythm of the harvest. The fear had not vanished, but it had subsided into a dull thrum, a background noise like the ever-present mist. Hisako focused on her hands. They were calloused now, the nails permanently rimmed with black soil. She found a strange comfort in the repetitive motion. Drive the fork, lift, sift, drop. It was mechanical. It was a way to make the hours disappear. The squeal of the brakes came, exactly on schedule. "Don't look," Hideko murmured, her voice almost a chant. It was the same warning she gave every day. "Focus on the work. We are not here." "We are invisible," Hisako obeyed. She stared at the dark, damp earth. She heard the familiar hiss of the door, the familiar cascade of high voices. She heard the small feet hitting the gravel of the roadside. She counted in her head, waiting for the sounds to fade as the children moved down their forest path. But today, one set of sounds did not fade. The chattering voices recede in the distance, but a different sound remained, the soft crunch of small shoes on gravel, closer than usual. Then silence. Hisako felt it before she saw it. A gaze. It was a tangible pressure, like a hand hovering just above her skin. It was steady, unwavering, and aimed directly at her. The rule was clear. Do not look. Do not engage. To do so was to invite trouble, to break the fragile, unspoken treaty. A guard might see it as an attempt to communicate, a violation of the camp regulations forbidding contact with civilians. Or worse, it might break the spell of indifference and invite the mockery they had all initially feared. She tried to ignore it. She drove her fork into the earth with renewed force, but the feeling intensified. It was a heavy, persistent curiosity. Slowly, agonizingly, against every instinct for self-preservation Hideko had drilled into her, Hisako lifted her head. A child was standing there, not on the far side of the road, but directly at the fence line, her small hands curled around the lowest strand of barbed wire. She was a girl, no older than 6. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hair was a startling shade of yellow, like straw in the sun. But it was her eyes that held Hisako captive. They were blue, a deep, clear, impossible blue, like shards of the Oregon sky. Hisako had never seen eyes like that. They were not filled with malice or hatred or the cruel laughter of propaganda. They were not bored, like the guards, or wary, like the man in the truck. They were simply curious. Hisako froze, her muddy hands suspended over the soil. The girl just watched her, tilting her head slightly, as if examining a strange new bird. Panic seized Hisako.
Where were the guards?
She darted a glance to the left. The corporal was 50 yards away, lighting a cigarette, his back to them.
What was this child doing? Shouting? Calling for the guard?
Preparing to throw something? The girl's lips parted. Hisako flinched, bracing herself. The girl said nothing. She did not move. She did not scream. She just stood, a small, silent figure in a blue dress, separated from Hisako by 3 yards of mud and a thin wire fence, watching her with those terribly blue, terribly human eyes. Hisako remained frozen, balanced on her knees in the mud. The world had shrunk to the few feet separating her from the wire fence. The child's blue eyes were unwavering. Hideko's voice, sharp and low, cut through the silence from somewhere to Hisako's left. "Don't look at them, Hisako. Turn away. Now!" Hisako flinched at the command, but she could not turn away. It was too late. The connection had been made, and the girl's gaze held no malice, only an intense, analytical curiosity. The child took one more small step, her worn leather shoes sinking slightly into the soft shoulder of the road. Her hand, pink from the cold, lifted. Hisako's breath hitched.
This is it, the spit.
The thrown mud, the sharpened rock. She braced, tensing her shoulders, lowering her head slightly, squeezing her eyes half shut. They laugh. Hideko's voice echoed in her memory. But the girl's hand was not balled into a fist. Her fingers were outstretched. The hand moved forward, pushing through the second strand of barbed wire. The wire snagged for a moment on the sleeve of her blue dress, and she carefully maneuvered her arm, her expression serious with concentration. In her small palm was a small brown rectangle. Hisako stared. She did not understand. It was just an object. Brown paper with silver foil peeking out at the edges. The girl pushed it further through the wire. She said nothing. She just held it there, an offering, her arm outstretched, waiting. Time stopped. The sound of the wind in the pines, the distant shouts of the other children, the scraping of Hideko's fork. It all faded. There was only this small, impossible gesture. It is poison. The thought was immediate, desperate. It is a trick. They are testing us. They want to see the animal take the food. The propaganda was clear. Do not accept their food. Do not accept their kindness. It is the precursor to the hook. Hisako's eyes darted to the corporal. He was no longer 50 yards away. He had moved closer, drawn by the silence, by the tableau at the fence. He was perhaps 10 yards distant now, standing near a fence post, his rifle held loosely, not aimed. He was watching.
He saw the girl.
He saw Hisako. He saw the offering. Hisako looked at him, her eyes wide with panic.
What was the rule?
Was this allowed? Was this a test he was conducting, using the child as bait? The corporal's face was unreadable beneath his helmet. He looked at the child, then at Hisako. He did not smile. He did not scowl. He just nodded, a single, slight downward tilt of his chin,
A gesture of assent.
or perhaps just acknowledgement. The girl, seeing the nod, pushed the bar a final inch. "Hershey's," she whispered. The word was soft, a puff of white mist in the cold air. Hisako's hand, caked in black mud, moved as if of its own accord. It was trembling violently. She reached out, her fingers clumsy and stiff. She expected the girl to snatch her hand away, to laugh, to reveal the trick. The girl did not move. Hisako's dirty fingernails brushed the silver foil. The object was solid. It was real. She took it. The girl's hand retracted, leaving the small brown bar in Hisako's muddy palm. She smiled, a quick, shy flash of teeth, and then, as if realizing she had broken some rule of her own, she turned and ran.
Her feet pounding down the gravel path after her friends, Hisako was left kneeling in the mud.
Staring at the thing in her hand. Hisako closed her fist around the small bar, the mud from her palm oozing around the paper wrapper. She felt the sharp corners of the rectangle press into her skin. It felt solid, heavy, and strangely warm against her cold hand. The walk back to the barracks was a blur. She kept her hand clenched at her side, her knuckles white. She felt the eyes of the other women on her, but no one spoke. The presence of the corporal, walking just behind the group, enforced the silence. But it was more than that. They had all seen it. They had all seen the girl, the offering, and the nod from the guard. The impossible had happened, and no one knew what to make of it. Inside the dim light of the barrack, the women dispersed to their cots, the scraping of their boots on the wooden floor loud in the quiet room. Hisako sat down heavily on her thin mattress. She did not unclench her hand. She stared at the wall, at a crack in the wood that looked like a jagged river. "What is it?" asked the young girl who had wept at the radio broadcast, her voice barely a whisper. Hisako did not answer. Slowly, as if her muscles were resisting, she opened her hand. The Hershey's bar lay in her palm, smeared with mud and sweat. The brown paper wrapper, with its bold, silver lettering, was stark against the grime. It looked like a thing from another world. The other women gathered. They did not crowd her, but formed a loose, wary circle, their faces drawn with exhaustion and a tense, fearful curiosity. They stared at the bar of chocolate. In the context of their lives, it was an absurdity. Their existence was measured in watery soup, hard bread, and the endless, aching monotony of the potato harvest. Their food was fuel, nothing more. It was sustenance dictated by the Geneva Convention, sufficient to keep them alive, but devoid of joy, comfort, or choice. This was a luxury. This was pleasure, wrapped in paper. It was a civilian item, a symbol of the very world that had imprisoned them. "It is poison," a woman from the far cot whispered, voicing the fear they all felt. "She is a child, but she is their child." "It is a trick. She was so small," Hisako murmured, more to herself than to them. She was seeing the blue eyes, the serious concentration, as the girl pushed the bar through the wire. "The smallest vipers are the most deadly," the woman insisted. Hideko, who had been standing back, pushed through the small group. She looked down at Hisako's hand. Her face was a mask, her expression impossible to read. She had been the most adamant, the most certain of the enemy's demonic nature. Her warnings were the bedrock of their survival. She stared at the Hershey's bar for a long time. Then she did something that shocked Hisako more than the gift itself. Hideko reached out a finger, her own hand calloused and dirty from the field, and she touched it. She didn't grab it. She just touched the edge of the wrapper, tracing the silver foil. "It is real," Hideko said. Her voice was flat. It was not an accusation nor an absolution. It was a statement of fact, and in it Hisako heard the sound of a great wall crumbling. Hideko's certainty had been the anchor. Now it was gone. If Hideko, who had seen Saipan, could admit this object was real, then everything was in question. If the child was not a demon, if the gift was not poison, then what were the guards?
What was the man in the truck? What was this entire war about?
Hisako felt a wave of vertigo. She carefully, almost reverently, placed the Hershey's bar on her knee. She did not wipe the mud off. She could not bring herself to eat it. To eat it would be to accept the kindness, to finalize the transaction.
And she was not ready for that. She just sat there,
guarding the small brown rectangle as the light faded from the room, profoundly and terrifyingly confused. Hisako sat with the muddy bar on her cot for what felt like hours. The lights in the barrack dimmed for the night count, but the small rectangle remained the brightest object in the room. It was a dense, heavy presence. The other women had retreated to their own spaces, but she knew they were not sleeping. They were watching and waiting. "You must throw it out, Hisako." It was Emmy, the woman from the far cot. Her voice was thin, strained by the darkness.
"It is a game. They want to see us fight over it.
Or perhaps it is slow poison. They want to watch us get sick. The guard nodded, Hisako said, her voice barely a whisper. He let her. He watched. To make the trick more convincing, Emi countered. But the certainty that had defined them was gone. Her words were hollow. Hideko, who had been silent since touching the bar, finally spoke. "What if it is not a trick?" she asked the dark room.
What if it is just chocolate?
The question hung in the air, more terrifying than any accusation of poison. If it was just chocolate, then the entire foundation of their hatred, the absolute necessary belief in the enemy's monolithic evil, was false. Hisako looked down at the Hershey's bar. Her decision, she realized, was not just about her. It was about all of them. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately. She began to pick the drying mud from the paper wrapper. It flaked off, revealing the bold silver letters, HERSHEYS. She carefully unfolded the brown paper, then peeled back the inner layer of silver foil. The chocolate beneath was dark, glossy, and scored into small rectangles.
A smell rose from it.
It was not the smell of potatoes or damp wool or fear. It was a sweet, dusty smell of cocoa and sugar. It was the scent of another life, of civilian bakeries in Tokyo, of celebrations, of peace. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. This was the true transgression. Not accepting the gift, but embracing it. "If it is poison," Hisako said quietly, "it is a very sweet-smelling one." With a sharp snap that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent barrack, she broke the bar in half. The sound made Emi gasp. Hisako broke the halves again. She turned to Hideko, who sat nearest to her. She held out one of the squares. This was the test. Emi shrank back. The young girl who wept by the radio watched, her eyes wide. Hideko, the nurse, the pragmatist, the one who had told the stories of Saipan's horrors, looked at the small, dark square. She stared at it for a long, heavy moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate hand, she reached out and took it. Hisako offered the next piece to Emi. Emi shook her head violently and turned to the wall. She offered the third piece to the young girl. The girl looked at Hideko, who was still just holding the chocolate, and then timidly she took her piece. Hisako was left with the final square. She locked eyes with Hideko. It was a silent pact.
As one, they raised the chocolate to their lips. Hisako placed the piece on her tongue. It was not poison. It was sweet. It was an overwhelming, rich, milky sweetness, so intense it shocked her senses.
It coated her mouth, thick and creamy. It was the flavor of a life she thought was lost forever.
A tear, hot and sudden, escaped her closed eyelid, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek.
It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, shattering release. She opened her eyes. Hideko was chewing slowly, her own eyes closed. The young girl nibbled at hers, her expression one of utter disbelief. The taste of the Hershey's bar did not just melt on her tongue. It dissolved the propaganda. It burned away the images of demons.
A demon could not give this. A child, yes. But not a demon. Hisako prokinulasi before the guards entered the barrack.
The cold morning air felt the same, but she was different. Tucked inside her thin mattress was a small, square piece of brown paper, carefully folded. She had saved the Hershey's wrapper. She had cleaned it meticulously, smoothing out the wrinkles. It was tangible proof they were marched to the field. The sky was a pale, washed-out grey, but Hisako thought it looked brighter. The pines seemed less menacing, their scent more like incense than the damp of a tomb. She began to work. Drive, lift, sift, drop. The rhythm was the same. The mud was just as cold, but the terror that had formed a tight knot in her stomach was gone. It was replaced by something else, something she could not name. It was a quiet, nervous anticipation. She found herself listening, not for the guards, not for farm trucks, but for the squeal of brakes. It came right on schedule. The yellow bus pulled to a stop. Hisako's hands paused on her harvesting fork. She looked at Hideko, who was working a few feet away. Hideko met her gaze. The older woman did not speak. She did not whisper. "Don't look." She simply held Hisako's gaze for a moment, then slowly turned her own head toward the road. Hisako turned. She did not hide her face. She did not cower. She stood up straight, her muddy hands at her sides, and she watched. The door hissed open. The children spilled out, their voices bright and chaotic. The small girl in the blue dress was among them. She bounded off the bus steps and immediately looked toward the fence. She was looking for Hisako. Their eyes met across the muddy road and the wire fence. The girl's face broke into a wide, luminous smile. She lifted her small hand and waved, a big, enthusiastic gesture that bounced her whole arm. Hisako felt a tightness in her chest. She felt the eyes of the other women on her. She saw the corporal standing by his post, watching the interaction with that same infuriating neutrality. She could not wave back. To wave back was a betrayal of something, of her nation.
Of her pride?
It was too much. It was too familiar, but she could not ignore the gesture. She could not return to the pretense of being invisible. So Hisako did what the guard had done for her. She offered a single, small, deliberate nod. The girl's smile, if possible, grew wider. It was an acknowledgement.
A shared secret.
It was enough. The girl then turned and ran, chasing her friends down the forest path. Hisako let out a long breath. She watched them go, then looked down at her hands. They were still covered in the soil of a foreign country. She was still a prisoner, thousands of miles from a home that was being bombed into ash. The war was not over. The fence was still there, but the demons were gone. The posters, the radio broadcasts, Hideko's stories of monsters, they had all been burned away by the taste of milk chocolate and the simple, uncomplicated wave of a child's hand. Hisako bent back to her work. She felt the small, square wrapper in her pocket, a talisman against the hatred. The enemy, she now understood, was not a monolith. The enemy had a face, and it was the face of a small girl with blue eyes,